This video is sponsored by Squarespace. More about them in just a moment. About a year ago, a channel called Redeem Zoomer posted a video claiming to debunk every atheist argument in 10 minutes. Subsequently, every atheist YouTuber and their nan responded to it, often refuting these refutations with relative ease. But what would happen if we did the opposite, and doggedly attempted to steelman Redeem Zoomer's points? As many of you know, I am an agnostic and thus a non-believer. Yet, I also think it is very important to challenge your pre-established positions, as it can aid learning and is also just rather fun. So, I will be inhabiting a character today, and he will attempt to debunk the more philosophical atheist arguments that Redeem Zoomer looks at. Obviously, I have many critiques of the positions my character will be giving, and I think some of them are just deeply flawed. But I'm deliberately not going to give my own criticisms in this video, so please do give your responses in the comments. I've even got a literal theist hat to wear to give a visual reminder because this is the internet. So, my name is Faux Jolly, this is solicited advice, and let's debunk some atheists. Also, I'm so glad that Peaky Blinders has ended so that I can wear a hat like this and not have everyone assume that I'm trying to be some kind of Birmingham tough man.
How do you know which religion is true? Well, everyone, religious or not, has faith in a certain worldview. It's just that some worldviews are called religions and some are secular. But everyone has to ask the question of which worldview best explains the world.
Redeem Zoomer's response here is to say that everyone has a worldview and that worldview has to account for the world and its phenomena. But we can flesh this out a little bit into a more developed argument. Essentially, we can think of God like a philosophical hypothesis. Our claim as theists is that the universe and its phenomena are best explained through the existence of an all-knowing, all-powerful, all-loving deity. A huge number of arguments for God attempt to show that there is something in the universe that is best accounted for with a being like this, or even better, only accounted for with a being like this. For example, the fine-tuning argument essentially suggests that the strongest way to explain why the universal constants are part of this tiny minority that can support life is because an intelligent being designed them that way. In a similar vein, the moral argument states that the best way to account for moral truths is to appeal to a divine intention that sets the correct way to act in his universe. The atheist must then show that such phenomena can be accounted for without God, or just dispense with the phenomena altogether. Hence, some atheists, like J.L. Mackie, deny that morality exists at all, or Graham Oppy argues that God does not actually make fine-tuning any more likely. So, asking how do you know which religion is true is somewhat arbitrarily restricting the question. The wider issue that gives birth to theistic belief is how can we best explain the world? Religion is downstream of this. So, when someone claims that atheism is simply a lack of a belief in God, this is technically true, but it also dodges an important question. Namely, atheists and agnostics do need to show how there are plausible models of the world where all of this phenomena that was previously explained by God can be explained by something else. Atheism by itself is something of a meta position. It is stating, I have a worldview or philosophy that does not include God. And it is true that this by itself does not incur much argumentative burden. But whatever worldview you have instead will still need defending. If you're a materialist, this will require the active reduction of everything in the world down to material, including mental states, consciousness, maths, logic, and morality. If you are a non-materialist atheist, like some secular Buddhists, or you have a Schopenhauerian metaphysics where the world is one undivided mass of will, then you'll need to show how that accounts for the world better than theism. In some ways, asking does God exist is a very lopsided way of framing the atheism-theism debate, since the theist automatically inherits the burden of proof, while the atheist can say no without elaborating further. Asking how does your worldview explain reality highlights that everyone either must defend their own position or profess that they do not know. It shows that God is not tacked onto the world by theists, but is instead an explanatory theory that we posit to explain certain events. So, yeah, take that, atheists.
There's 4,000 gods that people believe in, and you're atheist to 3,999 of them. I just go one god further. Okay, this isn't the gotcha that you think it is, because the question of whether some sort of god exists is fundamentally different from the question of which religion is right about God.
I think there are a few directions you can take with an argument like this. It seems to be inferring from the many different religious views out there that all religions must be false. First of all, diversity of opinion in itself does not imply that there is no right answer. When a similar argument was put forward by Christopher Hitchens, he said the following: "Since it is obviously inconceivable that all religions can be right, the most reasonable conclusion is that they are all wrong." But this simply doesn't follow. Imagine if I said, since it is obviously inconceivable that all interpretations of quantum mechanics are right, the most reasonable conclusion is that they are all wrong. We would quite rightly decry this as silly. However, if instead the challenge is to distinguish between the diversity of religious views in order to argue for your personal one, then we have a couple of options. The first is just to argue positively for one particular version of theism. In practice, this is what most religious thinkers will do, since most people are not theists in the abstract, but belong to a definite religion. How you choose to do this will ultimately depend on your faith. But if you are, say, a Christian, I dare say that you don't just disagree with atheism, but any religion incompatible with Christianity. You will have a direct argument for the plausibility of your God over the other 3,999. Another route would be some form of syncretism. This is the idea that different faiths have nuggets of truth to them, but may not have the whole truth. There are more modest forms of syncretism, like that of Pope Paul VI, who argued in Nostra Aetate that although Catholicism had access to proper, direct divine revelation and was the one true faith, other faiths may have shadows or reflections of divinity in them. By contrast, more extreme forms of syncretism would claim that every theistic tradition has access to part of the full divine truth, a bit like how the trunk of an elephant might feel very different to its tail, but they are still part of the same unified object. Alternatively, you can just advocate for a minimalistic theist position, where you just say God exists but don't go any further, as Redeem Zuma did here. Ultimately, though, we don't need to appeal to any of these, since the challenge itself rests on a false assumption. A variety of religions does not in itself challenge any of those religions, any more than a variety of economic views challenges the effectiveness of a given economic policy. The missing premise here that's needed for this argument to work is there is no way of arbitrating between theistic traditions. If there were a variety of theisms and no way of saying whether one was more plausible than any other, even in principle, then we could argue this points to religious questions being irresolvable or fruitless. But I just don't think this premise is true. Let's say that tomorrow we found out that Jesus never existed and that all documents that purport to show that he existed were falsified. This would make Christianity significantly less likely to be true than other theistic faiths. By contrast, if we found an indisputable eyewitness account of Jesus' ascension into heaven, written independently from any account we have now, that would be positive evidence for Christianity over other religions that did not have comparable literary evidence. This is partly what makes theistic artifacts like the Shroud of Turin worth investigating. They don't just provide potential evidence for God, but for the specific claims of a specific faith. Examples and hypotheticals like these suggest that arbitrating between religions is not impossible, and certainly not impossible in principle, and so the atheist argument simply doesn't follow. But before moving on, I want to take a brief moment to thank today's very kind sponsor, Squarespace. If you're looking to build a website, then you know it can be a real hassle. First, you have to choose a domain and then design the entire thing, and there's always this nagging voice in the back of your head warning you that you're creating something that doesn't just look messy, but actually looks quite unprofessional. But this is where Squarespace comes into play. They compress all of that complexity into a single platform and have ready-made templates to take all of that stress and headache out of website building. They also have a feature called Blueprint AI, which uses artificial intelligence to help you make design choices, which is very helpful if, like me, you're not necessarily that creative in the graphic design department. Head to squarespace.com/unsolicited advice and use the code unsolicited advice to get 10% off your first purchase of a website or a domain name. But anyway, back to the video.
If God created everything, then who created God? Well, God is defined as the uncaused causer. Everyone knows there needs to be a first cause at the beginning of the chain of all events in the universe, and it makes a lot more sense for that first cause to be a personal God who caused things for a reason, rather than some random impersonal force.
This is a classic atheistic reply to the first cause argument for the existence of God, which is often put something like this. 1. Everything has a cause. 2. There cannot be an infinite chain of causes. 3. Therefore, there must be a first uncaused cause. 4. That cause is God. Under this formulation, sure, the response definitely works, because everything has a cause conflicts with there must be an uncaused first cause. However, this is a pretty straw version of causal arguments for God. For instance, the Kalam cosmological argument states that everything that begins has a cause, and thus infers the existence of some eternal being that never begun that acts as the first cause. Using the principle of sufficient reason, we can then infer that whatever this eternal cause is, it must be the kind of thing that can, impromptu of nothing, originate a causal chain. The only thing in our world that sounds even remotely like this is an agent. Thus, we can infer that the first cause must be in some way agential and eternal. This is starting to look quite godlike in shape. Of course, there are plenty of things that an argument like this would not show. For example, it doesn't properly show that God is powerful in our world in the traditional sense, and by itself is much closer to deism than theism. However, no single argument needs to prove every part of theism. They each have their place. Just like how, in many contexts, we draw from multiple sub-arguments to get to our final ultimate conclusion. But, importantly, this particular atheist response doesn't work. The point here is not that God as a pre-existing concept is being introduced as a first cause, but that the cosmological argument establishes the existence of something eternal and then builds outwards from there to establish other properties of this eternal thing until it looks like God. The very first step of the argument explains why God would not need to be caused, since we have started from the existence of a thing without a beginning before we even associated it with any of these godlike qualities. A good example of this more sophisticated cosmological argument is William Lane Craig's book, The Kalam Cosmological Argument. Drawing from various Islamic scholars, he begins with the idea that the universe had a beginning and then must have a cause, and then builds outwards from there to establish what that cause might look like. And let's consider the alternative. If we abandon the idea that the universe itself must have had some reason to come into being, then we undermine a very important foundation of how we think about the world, the principle of sufficient reason. This states that for every event, or every macro event in some modern formulations, there is some reason as to how or why that event occurred. If we say that the universe can just pop into existence, then why don't other things pop into existence in a similar way? Why are there not constantly things fading in and out of existence at random? Normally we would say because there is no reason or cause for them to do so, but now we can't appeal to this. We either need to provide some explanation as to why the principle of sufficient reason suddenly came into being after the universe's origin, or just say that we don't know why the world now seems so predictable when metaphysically we have accepted that whole universes can arise spontaneously entirely of their own accord. Right, another atheist argument owned. I'm not going to lie, this is kind of fun. I can really see why people do this. I might actually take up apologetics as a hobby. But, moving on.
Science disproves God. Well, actually, the church invented modern science. All the founders of the scientific revolution deeply believed in God, and medieval theologians laid the groundwork for modern science by saying the world was governed by an intelligent creator. That means we can understand the world with our intelligence. And studying God led to studying the world because the world is God's creation.
Excluding the point about some scientists just happening to be religious, Redeem Zuma's argument here is that religion provides a very good foundation for expecting the universe to have predictable natural laws that we can study. So, Let's steelman. In the past, Agnostic Joe has pointed out that there are many other metaphysical frameworks that make the universe predictable. We could say that there are laws grounded in maths, which is in turn grounded in some Platonist worldview. We could say that we are forced to interpret the world as predictable because that is the only way that we can make sense of it, and so make the universe's regularity a kind of synthetic a priori. We could say that without predictable laws, life would struggle to emerge, and so we must expect any universe with us already in it to be relatively predictable, regardless of whether there is a god or not. However, there are some reasons to favour a theistic view above all of these. Take the Platonist option, for example. Here, there are abstract metaphysical forms which dictate the laws of the universe. But hang on a second. How exactly do these forms set these natural laws? Traditionally, the Platonist says that the natural world reflects these forms. But how does this reflection process take place? Surely the mere existence of forms is not enough. We need to have them interacting with the material world in the right way. For instance, why could our world not be governed by forms grounded in paraconsistent logic, which allows for real, existent contradictions? The possibilities for different logically definable forms seems endless, and we need some factor that whittles these possibilities down to the actual natural laws that we have in our universe. The choice must be unforced, since otherwise we would just push our question back a step. So, again, we need some kind of agent to set the rules, and an agent selecting the laws of the universe sounds at least a little bit godlike. Then we have the synthetic a priori option. This states that regularity is not a feature of the noumenal world, but instead the phenomenal world, or the world of our perceptions. But hang on. This picture totally undermines our ability to have real knowledge of the proper noumenal world. It traps us in our own perceptions, doomed to never quite touch the actual, real existence out there. Sure, Kant doesn't seem to mind this so much, but it is quite a lot to give up. And finally, this anthropic argument, where any universe with us in it just must be regular, kicks the can down the road. Why is it that our universe behaves in a regular and reliable fashion in the first place? To borrow an image from John Leslie, imagine that you've just survived being fired upon by 50 expert marksmen. You wouldn't say, well, I shouldn't wonder why they missed, because if they'd not, then I wouldn't be around to notice them not missing. You would suspect that they had missed on purpose. At the very least, it would pose a mystery. Of course, there are other possible ways to explain the universe's law-like nature, and we could just accept it as brute fact. But if we do want to account for the regularity in our reality, then an agential force does seem like the most economical and efficient way to do this without sacrificing our ability to know the world as it actually is. Another atheist argument disposed of.
If God is good, why can't he destroy all evil? Well, he eventually will. Why can't he do it now? Because he'd have to destroy you. Why does God let any bad things happen? Because we deserve it.
Radin Zuma's eventual response to why there is evil in the world is pretty laconic, simply saying that we deserve it when bad things happen to us. Of course, we could appeal to a different solution to the problem of evil, but let's go with this one for now and see just how much we can steelman it. I'm going to use a specifically Christian theology here, as that is the faith of Radin Zuma. First of all, let's remember that God is a perfect being, and that all perfection emanates out from him. The further we are from God, by definition, the further we are from perfection and goodness. Now, who among us can say that we are truly perfect, without sin and without flaws? Absolutely none of us. Even the saints were imperfect and were only perfected by their closeness with God. Furthermore, we as humanity rebelled against God, rejecting him in favor of our own desires by partaking of the forbidden fruit in the Garden of Eden, either metaphorically or literally. It is not just that we individually rebel against God, but that through our actions we have made the very world that we inhabit further from God, his grace and his perfection. We still have a conduit to God, though, as he has not completely abandoned us, but has a constantly outstretched hand inviting us back into his perfection after death through salvation. Considering that we are in continual rebellion against God through our imperfection and our sin, the question to ask is not, why do bad things happen, but how is it that good things still happen despite our separation from the very source of goodness and perfection? Importantly, this is not just saying that bad things happen because humans sometimes choose to commit bad actions. It is not necessarily that God is making bad things happen directly, but rather that in our distance from God, we are necessarily breaking from the source of all goodness, and this will naturally have poor consequences. This does not imply that God is actively and maliciously choosing to punish us in the same way that a teacher might punish a misbehaving student, but because living in sin, as we all are, and creating evil are one and the same action. Even so-called natural evils are ultimately the inevitable result of humanity's willful separation from God. If we were not such sinful creatures, then we would still be dwelling with God in an Edenic state, and we would not suffer from evil. This is the situation of those in heaven, whose souls have been made pure by God's grace, and who thus dwell in perpetual communion with perfection itself. Moreover, this ability to eventually achieve an eternal state of bliss with the origin of all that is good outweighs any kind of earthly suffering we might endure. As for hell, we can think of this as total separation from God, and thus total separation from all that is good. The physical torments that we use to describe hell are simply human expressions for the total privation of anything good, joyful, or holy. And this is not because God desires this state for us, but rather because he maintains that we are free to separate ourselves from him, or free to reconcile ourselves with him. If we choose separation, that is not on God, but on us.
Can God make a rock he can't lift? Well, you're just asking if God can contradict himself, like can God lie, or can God change, or can God make another God? And the answer to all those things is no. God being all-powerful means he can do anything to things outside himself. It doesn't mean that he can do anything to himself or that he can contradict himself.
This problem dates at least as far back as the Islamic philosopher Ibn Rushd, and purports to show that omnipotence is self-contradictory. I hope that I didn't mess up that pronunciation too much. If we define omnipotence as the ability to do anything, then we can ask, can this omnipotent God create a rock so heavy that even he cannot lift it? If the answer is yes, then God cannot lift the unliftable stone, and so there is something that he cannot do. And if the answer is no, then God cannot create the unliftable stone, which is also something he cannot do. Thus, omnipotence itself cannot exist, and thus God cannot be omnipotent. The standard response to this is put forward by Ibn Rushd himself, along with St. Thomas Aquinas and many others, and it essentially states that we are thinking about this all wrong. Just because God can do anything does not mean that he can do logically contradictory things. This is because contradictions are not things at all, but are meaningless statements that don't refer to anything. It's a bit like how a square circle not only does not exist, but the concept can't even be formulated. It doesn't even pick out a thought. Similarly, a rock so heavy God cannot lift it is a contradictory concept. Another way of putting it would be a rock so heavy that a being who can lift anything cannot lift it. This clearly brings out its contradictory construction. It is not that God is not omnipotent, but that the request is nonsense. Like saying, can God create the slithy toves that did gyre and gimble in the wake? It has syntactic structure, sure, but upon closer inspection, it is actually meaningless. Alternatively, we can take a totally different approach. A thinker like Lev Shestov argued that literally all things are possible through God, even the seemingly impossible and including the logically contradictory. So Shestov might say that God can create a stone he cannot lift, and then he can lift it anyway. God is not bound by the laws of logic, and so can sustain these contradictory statements as true if he so pleases. For Shestov, it would just be misguided to say that God works under classical logic, or even under a paraconsistent logic. Rather, God is simply not bound by any kind of axiom. He can assign truth values to propositions at will, entirely non-compositionally and free from any kind of strict inferential structure. This is a tricky idea to get your head round, and it is so quintessentially Shestov, but it does technically solve the rock issue. Yet another response would be to say that God's nature grounds logic, and his behaviour must therefore be fundamentally logical. So it is not that he could not sustain contradictions in the sense of not having the power to do so, but that it would not be in accordance with his nature, and so he would never do it. We can understand this with the analogy of an incredibly physically strong but fundamentally kind person. They have the mere ability to go around doing horrible things and causing untold suffering, but it is not in their nature to do so. This doesn't mean that they are less powerful, but just that they would never choose to use that power to do certain things.
Why did God let evil exist at all? So he could be glorified in defeating it. Triumph over evil is a greater good than evil having just never existed.
I think this is going to be quite tricky to defend, but I'm going to give it a go. First, we can refer back to what we said earlier about evil simply being distance from God. To say that God lets bad things happen is a bit of a misnomer. If bad things happen, it is necessarily because there is some separation between our world and God. It is not that God has decided that bad things will happen, but that we create separation between us and him through our sinful rebellion, and thus allow evil to enter the equation. But that aside, let's consider just how much greater and wiser God is than ourselves. Compared to his supreme intelligence, we are like an ant attempting to read Shakespeare. For example, take my dog Rosie when we go to the vets. When she is injected with an anesthetic or some other entirely medically necessary solution, she will yelp and cry and think that something awful is happening to her. She cannot comprehend that this is actually in her best interests, and that this tiny hurt is only there to avoid a much greater hurt further down the line. There is an overarching reason for her suffering. It is not that Rosie does not understand that the pain is for the greater good, it is that she cannot understand it. No matter how hard she tries, it is simply beyond her capabilities. Likewise, think about our relationship to God. No matter how diligent or well-meaning our attempts, it would be foolish to think that we could grasp the inner workings of an all-powerful, all-knowing being. If God does exist, we would expect aspects of his plans to look borderline insensible to us lowly humans down here on Earth. So when we cannot explain why God allows awful things to happen, that is no point against God. It is just showing exactly what we would expect on a theistic worldview, that we cannot make sense of everything that happens in its entirety because it is guided by a providential hand that is far beyond our understanding. This is perhaps most famously put in the book of Job, where God says, "Who is this that obscures my plans with words without knowledge? Where were you when I laid the earth's foundations? Tell me if you understand." In a world with God, we should expect certain parts of it to not make sense to us. Although, just to interject, it is worth reflecting on whether this is compatible with God's inherently logical nature, seemingly making science and scientific laws possible. There are various other ways we could account for God allowing evil in the world. The classic way of conceiving of evil is as a test, either to purify our own souls or just to encourage humanity to cease our rebellion against God. Additionally, we can argue that any innocents who are killed as a result of the world's imperfections will ultimately end up in heaven, and thus an eternity of bliss. And this should outweigh any damages that they incur. Under most theistic frameworks, it's actually quite difficult to disprove God's existence with suffering in the world, since he has ample opportunity to make up for it in the afterlife, and his wider intentions are likely so far beyond our understanding that we would not be justified in saying that he simply cannot have a good reason for allowing suffering to happen just because the suffering seems pointless from our limited human standpoint. But back to this idea that it is better to triumph over evil than for evil to have never existed. The standard atheist response to this is something like, would you say it is better for malaria to have never existed, or for it to eventually be overcome once it has already claimed millions of lives? And yes, from our human perspective, it does seem better for malaria to have never existed. But we must consider what God wants. God is probably less interested in the immediate consequences of our actions in the world, since they must seem like tiny flashes to an eternal being. He's probably more interested in the contents of people's souls and their intentions. It may actually be better on this soul-based moral system for suffering to occur, so that it might inspire selfless moral actions and compassionate intentions from others, that then bring people closer to salvation. After all, the suffering that inspired those intentions is temporary, whereas the effect on the compassionate person's soul is potentially eternal. From a God's eye point of view, triumph over evil may truly be better than no evil at all.
Psychology explains why you believe in God. So what? If God is real, we should expect there to be some psychological or social benefit to believing in him. Spiritual experiences can be explained by brain chemicals. Well, romantic experiences can also be explained by brain chemicals, but that doesn't mean your wife isn't real. So spiritual experiences being explained by brain chemicals doesn't mean that God isn't real. Well, drug trips show that spiritual experiences are from the brain. Well, people who have had both drug trips and near-death experiences say that they're completely different categories of feeling.
Radim Zuma then has a series of points about how the psychological benefits of believing in God do not disprove him, but actually provide positive evidence for God. But I think we can bolster this defense a little bit further. Firstly, we can extend our observations about the benefits of believing in God. Religion can make people happier, perceive their life as more meaningful, and may even increase social cohesion, but beyond that, we can argue that we humans have a natural craving for God, a God-shaped hole, if you will. C.S. Lewis makes this point in his famous Argument from Desire. We first notice that all of our natural innate desires correspond to something in the world that fulfills them. Our thirst can be quenched by water, our hunger can be sated by food, and our sexual instincts can be alleviated by and so on. It would seem incredibly strange if we had this intense inner hunger and yet food did not exist. So inductively, we can infer that if we have an innate craving, there is probably something that will satisfy it. But Lewis argues that we do have an innate desire for something beyond and outside of our world, something ineffable and infinite. He calls this craving Sehnsucht, apologies for pronunciation again, and argues that it is only a connection with God that can satisfy this need. It is similar to Kierkegaard's point that a personal relationship with the divine can stifle our existential despair once and for all. Of course, you might say, well, yeah, you can desire all sorts of stuff, but it doesn't mean it will happen. Richard Dawkins recently gave the example of wanting to be with a famous supermodel, stating that just because you want it to be the case doesn't mean that it will be. But Lewis's argument is subtly different. Crucially, although you might not want to be with the supermodel does exist. There is someone out there who would satisfy this basal desire. For Lewis, the same is true of God. That we have this desire that cannot be sated by anything other than God provides positive evidence for his existence. One vein of critique here is to question whether God is the only thing that satisfies this desire, or to question the existence of the desire in the first place, or to say that it is satisfied by something, but it's satisfied by a belief in God rather than God himself. But sorry, I'll get back into role. The second argument that Radim Zuma responds to is that spiritual experiences can be reduced to brain chemicals, and that this somehow implies that they are necessarily non-veridical. He states that all experiences are going to have neurobiological correlates, so this cannot rule out the idea that religious experiences are evidence for God. We can strengthen this point by imagining how we would stretch the atheist argument further. Would we say that because there are neurobiological correlates of seeing trees, that means that trees aren't real? If we push this argument through to its extreme conclusions, it threatens to trap us in complete skepticism, where every one of our experiences is falsified by the mere fact that it correlates to some chemical combination in the brain. The atheist might then reply by saying that in those other cases, we have physical, observable things that correspond to those experiences, whereas religious experiences cannot be independently verified by some kind of third party. But again, there are lots of experiences we take to be veridical that cannot be checked in this way. No one can verify my report on my own emotional state, but people will tend to believe it and not doubt it all that much. Moreover, we would expect religious experiences to be highly different to our ordinary ones, and to perhaps be more akin to a private revelation. After all, God can talk to us directly in our minds, which is something that no human can achieve. The fact that the same phenomena can also occur in drug trips simply shows that there is more than one way to achieve the same experience. Inferring from this that all religious experiences must be non-veridical is like saying that because a photorealistic picture of a tree can fool some people into thinking it is a real tree, that must mean that we cannot know that trees exist. Sure, you can say that, but again, you become committed to an overarching skepticism and end up concluding that we cannot know very much at all. If we dismiss religious experiences simply because they have these neurobiological correlates in the brain, we would also have to dismiss so many of our other experiences that it would decimate our epistemology. Of course, if you haven't had a religious experience yourself, then this whole divergence might be irrelevant, as by its very nature, you can't tap into someone else's religious experience.
Faith is the opposite of logic and reason. No, it's not. Faith just means trust. Anytime you eat food, you're having faith that it's not poisoned, even if you can't scientifically prove it. If you're married, you have faith that your wife loves you, even if you can't scientifically prove that. And if you tried to scientifically prove it, she'd probably get very mad at you because it would mean you didn't trust her.
Redeemed Zuma responds to this atheist argument by saying that faith just means trust, and that if we trust in God, we should not question him too much. But this does leave the obvious atheist response. Why would God leave any doubt as to whether he exists? We don't need to have much faith that gravity exists or that the sun exists because we see these things every day explicitly and unmistakably. So really, a stronger atheist argument is, why is faith necessary in the first place? But this issue might not be insurmountable. Consider this. Traditionally speaking, God values our personal freedom incredibly highly, to the point where he will allow us to commit grave acts of evil and sin towards one another simply because to intervene too heavily would be to compromise that freedom. Above all, he does not want to foist obedience upon us, but leave it open for us to reject his love, as foolish a choice as that would be. But it is plausible that being certain of God's existence would deprive us of a great degree of moral freedom. And let me explain what I mean by this. Believing in God is actually pretty unique among beliefs, because it implies so much about how we should behave. A true, certain believer in God would shift their whole life towards serving him. This is a straightforward implication of believing that something or someone is the source of all that is good in the world. However, this then means that belief in God is radically different to believing in the sun or believing in gravity, because a belief in God implies a myriad of behaviors. It implies obedience and worship and an entire moral landscape. To believe in God is not simply a certain propositional attitude, it is a compulsion to certain behaviors. It would be borderline impossible for any minimally rational person to believe wholeheartedly in God and yet choose to disobey him and reject his love, because an eternity in heaven is such a sweet deal, and an eternity in hell sounds unimaginably awful. This point has been raised by many philosophers of religion, such as John Hick and Michael Murray, who both suggest that if God revealed himself to us in indisputable ways, then that would indirectly force any rational creature to obey him. Thus, it is not that God is arbitrarily hiding from us, but rather that if he was not at least partly hidden, then that would indirectly undermine our free will. So, a leap of faith is necessary. Alternatively, we could consider the increased moral culpability that we would have if we knew that God existed without any doubt. As it stands, even if we live our lives in rebellion against God, we have one excuse that could reduce our guilt before him. We were not certain that we were rebelling against him because we were not certain that he did exist. Just as someone might have their charges reduced from murder to manslaughter if they did not know that their reckless actions would cause someone's death, we could plead a certain innocence before God if we were not certain of his existence. But this only works if a conscious leap of faith is required to believe in God, rather than his existence being obvious or implied rationally. So it is not for the benefit of believers that God remains hidden, but for the benefit of unbelievers. Though it is worth noting that the two responses I've outlined in this section are entirely incompatible with one another, so you do have to pick one. So, that is my steelman version of Redeemed Zuma's video. Please do leave your responses in the comments and see if you can spot some of their flaws or potential rebuttals, as there are many of them in my opinion. Plus, if you want to examine the different types of arguments for God and how to challenge each one, I have a video on that very subject right here. Thank you so much for watching, and have a wonderful day.